what is the realistic remedy? The only remedy, and that's the one the framers gave to the Congress of the United States, the House and the Senate, is the remedy of impeachment, because no one can interfere with it. The critically important thing about impeachment is that there is no executive privilege in impeachment. That becomes an impeachable offense. You ask the president to tell you what he knew and when he knew it. You ask the president or the vice president to give you the contents of the FBI statement. They don't do that. That becomes an impeachable offense. You could ask them to provide them the information under oath. You may not be able to finish the task, but you certainly can start the task, which will send an important signal, not just to this president, but to future presidents, because I completely agree with Congressman Barr that this can only be a floor. And God help us if that's the case. I mean, the country, the Constitution, our democracy. We can pass Congress can pass all the statutes that it wants, and a president who doesn't feel bound by the law can ignore them. That is the problem. Prosecution, I agree that the precedent that was set with regard to President Nixon is that a sitting president cannot be prosecuted. The Anti-Torture Act, because it carries a death penalty, has no statute of limitations at all in cases where death occurred in the course of torturous interrogations. That statute applies to any U.S. national. I take that to include people at the highest rungs of the U.S. government. So anyone who engaged in torture could be prosecuted for the rest of his or her life. But aside from prosecution and maybe down the road, a truth commission, I'm sure there are other remedies that can be applied, the real remedy to a president who believes that he is above the law and continues to act on that belief systematically is impeachment. And there's no running away from that. That's the problem. And so the question is, what do we do about it? What does Congress do about it? And I think the American people want to see Congress act. What is a high crime and misdemeanor? Mr. Mason said that it was subverting great and dangerous offenses that subvert the Constitution. Subverting the Constitution here is when the president, for no reason, not even a colorable claim, refuses to give Congress the information it needs to do its job and obstructs the work of Congress. That can be an impeachable offense. If you translate it in an impeachment inquiry, in other words, if you were to commence an impeachment inquiry, and then you were to ask the president to provide the information again, the obstruction of an impeachment inquiry, the failure to cooperate with an impeachment inquiry, the failure to provide the information, is itself an impeachable offense, as we established in the Nixon proceedings and in the Nixon precedent. When we started the impeachment process, it was not done by Congress. It was done because of the Saturday Night Massacre and the American people. That's what triggered the Congress to act. When we started, nobody knew what the head count was going to be on the House Judiciary Committee. It was partisan. We had Republicans who stood their side and Democrats who stood their side. But nobody had been in this kind of proceeding for 100 years. And so people were feeling their way. How did it work? How did we bring Republicans and Democrats together? Well, partly it was, and I think the chair will remember this, the fact that Congressman Rodino understood that the process had to be completely fair. So the Democrats picked for the committee counsel for impeachment a Republican, and the Republicans picked a Republican. So that was one way of saying, look, we're not going to do this on a partisan way. That was a way of bringing people along. There was no poll that was taken. There was no head count that was taken. We were in totally uncharted waters. And what we tried to do was to do it right. And ultimately, the facts and the fairness of the process persuaded people on both sides of the aisle that this was the right thing to do. And it wasn't just Republicans. You had Southern Democrats who had more, if you will, pro-Nixon constituents than some of the Republicans on the committee, and they had to come along. How did you bring people along? By a fair process, by assuring, and fair to the president too. The president's counsel said, well, I want to have one witness, take 5. So that there were never issues that got in the way. That's what